I'd like to welcome everyone to today's panel on provenance and estates. And first, to start off by having the other panelists, Stephanie Camu and Martin Harrison, introduce themselves. And then I'll introduce myself quickly. And then we'll go into a session of question and answer among the three of us. Stephanie, would you like to start?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Camu, and I'm a founding partner of Southern & Partners. We are an artist management agency and have been working for almost 2 to 3 decades directly with artists, dealing with many of the issues that come up in today's panel, and most notably around catalogue raisonné and provenance.
Thank you. Martin?
Hello, I'm Martin Harrison. I was the editor of the Francis Bacon catalogue raisonné, which was published, it took 10 years, and it was published in 2016, just over 4 years ago.
Thank you. I am Susan Cooke. From 2002 to 2018, I was Associate Director of the Estate of David Smith, which around 2014 made a commitment to do a catalogue raisonné of the artist's sculpture. You're looking at David Smith as he is happily smoking a cigar, looking out over the south lawn of his property at Bolton Landing, where he made his permanent home from 1940. It's in upstate New York. He is best known to most people as a sculptor of steel works. You see him on the left next to Hudson River Landing in progress, and then on the right, 3 of the examples of his Cubi series, for which he's probably best known to most viewers. The next slide is an image of the first catalogue raisonné done by Rosalind Krauss. It was submitted for her doctoral dissertation in 1969 to Harvard University. And as you can see, when it was reprinted in 1977, it was dense with information and also very small black and white photographs. Time passed. David Smith had died in 1965. He had 2 young daughters. And as I said, in 2014, approximately, they decided to embark on the process of gathering up all the information that had transpired in the last 40 years about not only the collection that they held of their father's work, but works that were out there in the world. David Smith did a variety of sculptures. You can see the next slide shows the diversity of his work in different media. And so just to close that section off, I'll speak a little bit about David Smith again later, but I'd like to actually start with the questions and throw the first one to Stephanie. Stephanie, in working with a living artist, how have you approached the process of documenting provenance? And do you have any thoughts about updating in the future over time?
Well, the Bill Viola studio, which is run and managed by Bill's wife and collaborator, Kira Paroff, has kept meticulous archive records of all the works that have been sold, and they've been working with pretty much the same gallerists and representatives for 25 years. So they have pretty good, accurate information. And our objective with the catalogue raisonné, which will be a digital online catalogue raisonné, is to be able to capture all of that information in one place, thereby making it pretty easy to ascertain provenance and all of the information that anyone might possibly need for individual works.
Martin, what was it like for you to be working on Francis Bacon's catalogue raisonné? You said that at one point you mentioned that he cared not at all about provenance. Did that have an impact on the research you then had to do for the catalogue raisonné?
I think he only cared about a catalogue raisonné because his gallery persuaded him to take notice of it. But I'm talking now about the first catalogue raisonné, and the thing to stress for those that don't know is that mine was the second, and the first was produced by Sir John Rothenstein, introduced by him and really catalogued by Ronald Alley, a senior Tate Gallery curator of the time, in 1964. At that time, considerably less than half of Bacon's life total of works had been produced. But I mean, unlike many people doing catalogue raisonnés, it's a fine thing in itself, and it was, I think, generally admired by most people. And luckily for us, because we didn't start till 42 years after it was produced, it recorded a lot of things, clearly during Bacon's lifetime, with his semi or reluctant cooperation probably, but then speaking to people who knew him, who owned pictures, who of course weren't available to us 42 years later, neither was the artist himself. So that's unusual. I mean, I mentioned that our task was easier than many. I thought, well, I better just check that, because I'm talking to you, I never forget that we found in the end 584 paintings by Bacon, and there are about 60 sketches that we catalogue. That's the life total. And I found myself thinking of Zervos, and probably the most famous work of its kind, begun, of course, when Picasso was very much alive in 1932, and running to 33 volumes that Zervos did with 16,000 works. So that demonstrated to me, I don't particularly think always of the problem of producing a catalogue raisonné, but it reminded me of how different the task can be, you know. And of course, it's already been demonstrated how different it is to cataloguing moving imagery. So we've already got great contrasts.
And Martin, do you plan to continue tracking provenance and update?
We do update, and of course this is mostly, well, there's just two zones really. There is provenance first of all, and then exhibition history, of course, so they're being exhibited all the time. That is entirely digital really. It's been done through the estate of Francis Bacon's website. It goes on to be honest, I shouldn't think it's 100% up to date. It's very hard to keep up with these things. And in a way, to appoint someone, it's almost possibly a full-time job, just updating it. So it may be less than perfect, but certainly the intention's there. And there may well be an initiative in the fairly near future to check that everything is up to date, and that'll be up to date as of 2021, I suppose, and it will straight away go up to date, of course.
In working on the David Smith catalogue raisonné, as I mentioned, we could start with Rosalind Krause's work. She had started work with the estate from the very beginning, so she had a wealth of very primary source material. She also sent out questionnaires to all the owners, and those archives, which are now at the Museum of Modern Art, proved invaluable to us in terms of re-verifying the information, and also often revealed interesting stories, because the questionnaires elicited commentary from people who had known David Smith or knew something about the creation of the work, which wouldn't have been available to us otherwise. We then had to go back and re-verify all of those and trace the gaps between 1977 and the present day, which proved to be complicated and frustrating in some ways when we didn't get immediate responses. I was always surprised that people didn't, some responded very quickly, others were really non-committal and not forthcoming. And I think that issue of keeping provenance private or ownership private or hidden underneath private collection or LLCs has become an increasing obstacle to some ways for current catalogue raisonné researchers. Stephanie, you mentioned that in Bill Viola's work, there are various components. There's the actual video, there is the certificate of authentication, and that tracing all of that is an element of provenance research. Am I correct for you?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, you know, the studio has very complete records for the most part. The issue might come up where there's a resale that's done privately or work is gifted, and those might be more difficult to track. But really, when the owner owns a work by Bill Viola, it includes an archive box, and the archive box has, as you said, the certificate of authenticity, a letter of agreement from the artist and to the owner with the original owner's name and address, and a master tape, which is effectively the work which is on this tape. Mm-hmm. So that's really, effectively, it's the work.
One of the issues that I was always struck by in doing provenance research was the degree to which it relied on building relationships with private collectors, with institutions, registrars, galleries. And I'm curious to hear whether you, Martin, or Stephanie, how you approach that relationship building process, and if you have any tips for people who might be embarking on it now.
Well, I was interested in what you said about the usefulness of Ros Krause's work on David Smith and her contacts. And I sat here instantly feeling I learn as much as these discussions with you people as I give out, I'm sure. And I thought, you know, I never use tape recorders, and I try to meet as many owners as possible, quite a lot of whom I know, including one of the great collectors in London. They're no longer with us, sadly. But I always took notes, and that's people that seem to suit them better. And my scrawl, which is I'm afraid what it is, I realized not long ago, it's my duty in a way to get these transcribed, checked by me while I still can, and make them available for similar reasons. Because I was party to some very interesting stories from certain owners, and interesting and relevant to the art, really. Because they were intelligent buyers and they met the artist, and so on. So that's an aspect of following up in that way that really I haven't done and intend to, sort of retrospectively, as it were, because I can certainly see the value of that. It sounds rather, I mean, I suppose I didn't, because you think, oh, who am I to have my writings written up? You know, I mean, I write the books, but that's bad enough. But, you know, but I realize they have a value quite outside of me, the interviews that I've done. But we didn't do things like send out a questionnaire as such. I mean, we did to ask the people to respond with the basic details of the work they had. And if sometimes we'd ask if it was in a really remote country, if they had a good picture and so on. But I tried to get to see pretty much everything around the world, you know, and as you said, it's more and more difficult to have anything other than private collection. And we discussed this when we last spoke, and some of the owners, while being completely cooperative and elegant and offering you drinks and everything and saying, come back whenever you want, we've learned so much about our painting. But then they metaphorically put a gun to your head when they said, and you may not say anything other than private collection. It mustn't say the city, the country. End of story, you know, and of course you can't renege on that deal. So, you know, pretty much everything, with very, very few exceptions. One person actually insisted to be named, which was, I think, unique. One collector said, and I want my name in, good for you. And one or two others are still known, but very, very few. If that's of use to people, then my catalogue raisonné is useless.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's a different situation because we're dealing, you know, the artist is still living, and the artist and his wife have relationships directly with a lot of those collectors, institutions, curators, museum directors, and so forth. So it's quite easy to access information as needed. But I think the idea of a questionnaire is really great, and actually something that I think try and use ourselves. But it's interesting because I think we take it for granted that those relationships and those stories are related between individuals who are here today, but how long will they be here is, you know, no one knows. So it would be best to record those and definitely, you know, they would be a valuable part of the archive, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to move on to the question of the role, the weight that you have given, each of you, to provenance when you're, or if you're confronted with questions of authentication and even attribution. Is that it's one variable and it's often highly prized, but it's also sometimes absent. So Martin, perhaps have you had cases where you had to authenticate works for which you could not secure a good provenance chain?
I don't think I stressed when we first spoke a while ago that it was never just me. There was a 5-person authentication committee, which the support of my colleagues was very important for me. 3 were art historians, 1 was a technical advisor, and myself, and a secretary recorded the minutes and so on of the meetings. This was really, it's really the lack of a provenance, but I think in a way that's what you're speaking about, which was one of the factors that made us very suspicious about works which visually looked very unconvincing anyway. You'd be amazed how many, because we were in London always looking at these works, which always had to be sent to London, which was a methodology of that was complicated and expensive, and it involved insurance and so on. But they were all sent to London, and it's amazing how many were bought at a market somewhere you've never heard of in the United States. And it's they were unconvincing in every possible way, but no one could ever trace it to one of Bacon's 2 main galleries during his life. First of all, because the records of both were pretty good, and they didn't seem to think to. So clearly in that broad sense, provenance was crucial. And then in the opposite direction, I think Bacon's really hard to fake. And so our job wasn't in many ways so difficult, but and when people try, even 1 or 2 people who try quite well, it's pretty obvious the slips. You can't force spontaneity. You can't force the brush strokes he did. There's no way you can recreate it. Only he can do that, whatever you think of him. And there were 2 I didn't think of when we spoke before, which the owner wouldn't submit to us, and they were subsequently stolen. There was a lot about it in Spain a few years ago when they were stolen, and we had poor photographs of them. Now, from the provenance, you could say you're 99% sure already that they were genuine. Mm-hmm. We can never do anything about it because we never saw the paintings, and they've now been stolen and not yet been returned. So others were stolen, but we had seen them and we knew they were authentic, and they're very well recorded in Marlborough's archives, the Marlborough Gallery's archives. And there was no doubt about those, and I suspect there isn't about the other 2, but since we haven't seen them, there's not much one can do about that. But that's a question where I'm now daring to say to you, and that from the provenance, I'd say they were genuine. Of course, that doesn't mean they are, but they're 99% certain to be. I don't know whether that helps.
Stephanie, you mentioned an interesting issue with the duplication or replication of works by Bill Viola, that because they exist as an audio duplicatable medium, and that sometimes can raise questions of whether it's his work in a sense, but it's not the authentic work that would be accepted by the estate. Am I correct?
Well, actually, I mean, we have a very different situation than Bacon because it's video, and by its nature, the medium is reproducible. And there haven't been any issues of works that have been copied. Nobody's come for authentication of anything yet. The only instance is when there have been, and this goes back a very long time ago, which the VHS copies, so that tells you how long ago it was, were given at auction or by the studio for charity auctions, for the ICA, for various institutions generally. And there would be a photograph signed by Bill Viola, but it was never intended, and generally in the catalog, it would say that this wasn't a unique Bill Viola work. It's kind of like I'm not even sure how to describe it, because it's almost like a memento in a way. And we have had people who have come and tried to have those authenticated, and somebody in particular who I'm thinking of, who knew exactly what it was, but was still trying to get it passed off as an authentic, unique work by Bill Viola. So it's still early days for us in terms of putting together this catalogue raisonné. And again, the records are pretty good still at this point. So I think it'll be in 10, 15, 20, 25 years. That's when I think real issues will come up. And that's why, ensuring that there is a very comprehensive archive, documentation for all of the works that are sold. And in the instance of, video work, Bill will make a work that will be, the single work will be an edition of 5, maybe more, as much as 12. So you've got 12 of the same work that's in circulation. And today we know who most of the owners are of those works. So it's not an issue, but further down the line, it could become very tricky.
Interesting. In terms of David Smith, we were, I suppose, fortunate in the sense that he rarely gave works away. He did sell work during his lifetime, and there were records. He also recorded in photographs, which were invaluable because they both documented the presence of the object in his studio before his death, and also in some cases showed the progress of the creation of the object, so that we could note changes over time in the shape of the sculpture, or sometimes in bases that he created himself and that were later replaced by a collector. And I have one example just to show, which was an object that we had no record of until we noticed in an exhibition up at the Hyde Museum in upstate New York, that it was listed and with a title that was unknown to us and an owner that we didn't know anything about. We were ultimately able to, through public records, check the transmission of that object to heirs and contact the heirs. And luckily, they could then fill in some of the information, and they also were able to bring the object in so that we could look at it and also look at the back, which had David Smith's inscription and dating information. And as it turned out, we realized then that it matched very closely to an object that was in the estate still, and one of a very unusual pair of ceramic plates, glazed ceramic plates that David Smith made during a short period. So filling in gaps through exhibition catalogues, then through public records, and then the visual evidence has been one of the more, I would say, fun parts of tracing provenance for us. In terms of, as you look back, if you were a scholar in the future, or hoped that a scholar in the future might look back at the histories of provenance you've created, are there certain things that you think might be worth further research? In other words, who were Bacon's early collectors? Were there certain types of people? And did that then influence either what he did or where the work was shown? Or with institutions, Stephanie, the idea that the work is out in the public, being shown in institutional exhibitions, how does that alter the sort of history of the artist's development or of the critical thinking about the work? Martin, you want to start?
He began painting, or the first record of a painting is 1929, when he was still only 19, and he was basically untrained. And his patrons were almost entirely, up until 1945, or even a little later, family and friends. Only 1 or 2 exceptions to that. And since he destroyed almost everything he painted in those 16 or so years, that means there's a very small body of works with known provenances. They are certainly very interesting. But he was an unusual story. He's an unusual person, and I shouldn't think there's another artist that followed the same sort of trajectory as Bacon. He was basically giving out most of the time. And I mean, one of the things, the painting that's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, called Painting 1946, is becoming a well-known-ish story. It was bought by a friendly dealer in 1946 for what was then £200. And she sold it on to Alfred Barr, who bought it for MoMA in 1948. That was the first work of Bacon's to enter any museum anywhere in the world. So the USA was ahead of his native country there. But that was still an unusual event. And it was only after 1948, shortly after, that he began to be collected by museums or, as it were, outside buyers. So he's a very unusual case in that respect. Since he did destroy so much, there isn't much work to find from his early career up to 1946. There was only one, really, that we had to find, as it were, and luckily did. And then one that we could never get photographed or see. This is slightly digressing, but I didn't mention it before. In terms of provenance, I tracked it down, and the owner would not let me see it or have it photographed unless I gave it the title that she said it should have, which was mistitled in an Italian catalogue in the 1950s. There's a ludicrous misuse of English, and it was never called that. I should have lied, but I try not to. I said, we can't do that. It's got a title, it's an authentic title, and it must be called that. I said, right, you can't see my painting then. She subsequently died. No one knows where it is at the moment. So there's one, it said we had a picture, not perfect, and that's in the catalogue raisonné. That was a unique instance, but one or two people were difficult. And I imagine, especially nowadays when so much is going into private collections, people doing other catalogue raisonnés might encounter similar and greater problems in a way. If owners are recalcitrant about divulging anything, and it's within their right to refuse to let you see the work, of course, if they wish to. Force your entry, or you have to try and be persuasive. But well, as I explained, in one case it didn't work. But.
Stephanie, since Bill Viola's work is so often, I guess throughout his career, has been seen in a public context, how do you see that as shaping either his market or the critical reception of his work?
Well, Bill started working in the 1970s, and so mid-1970s is when his first works were dated. And, some of them it was a very avant-garde media at the time. So, there weren't that many people who were collecting it. And even institutions were a little bit wary. You had Barbara London at MoMA, who was, very supporting the cause. And so there aren't that many works in the very early years, but as time goes on, Bill made a lot of huge installations. They were room size. So most of the work was probably collected by institutions or by some really kind of wacky people who were willing to take a risk. And it was really in the 1990s, mid-90s in particular, where Bill started making work on these flat panel screens. And it meant that more private collectors could have something that was on a domestic scale in their house. And Bill, as a techno geek, as he describes himself, and so he loves to play with technology and do things with the technology that it was never meant to do. So he's always pushing it to its limits and experimenting. And so he would do crazy things, and that made it, I think, a little bit more difficult in some respects, because some of the work would be, the requirements for showing it would be quite challenging. Again, for a private collector, not so much for an institution, but he wasn't making work for institutions or collectors. He was just making work that he felt, he needed to make, that was inside of him and he needed to get out.
Mm-hmm. David Smith had, during his lifetime, he certainly sold works primarily to private collectors. He was also someone who understood how to work with art critics, with curators. And so his voice and information was often present in their commentaries and catalogues, or in interviews they did, or in articles they wrote, where in our archives, we actually have an interview on which all that data was based. And I think that sense of him wanting to get the work out, if physically into the world through exhibitions, but also in a kind of intellectual sense, later, when it was really only after his death that large numbers of his works went into public collections, and that was in part due to one of his executors, the critic Clement Greenberg, who I think was very keen to secure Smith's position by placing works in various institutions across the country. And that too then led to large exhibitions and furthered the sort of critical and art historical research on his body of work. So I think using provenance and using exhibitions as a way to, for the artist to sort of direct how the work is responded to and received by the more general public is one of the, I think, interesting aspects of looking at research on provenance and its correlation with then where work gets shown and then who talks about it. Martin and Stephanie, are there any other tips or particular aspects of provenance research that you thoroughly enjoyed or that have proved problematic? Or again, if you were advising an artist working today or an artist's estate coming fresh to this project, what would be one or two things you would recommend they do first?
Documentation, documentation, documentation. For a young artist today, that's the only way to be able to keep track of, you know, your work and make sure that it's protected. And it's critical. Particularly, it depends on the medium. Obviously, painting is a little bit easier, but that's probably quite easy to copy as well in some ways.
And would that documentation extend to especially for a work which is time-based or multimedia, the actual material components of the work, so that in years later, a museum, thinking ahead, that a museum will need to perhaps restore work or make it functional once technology has moved on?
That's a big issue. And I would say that it's probably, you know, conservation of the medium is probably the most important time-consuming aspect of a lot of what the work the studio is doing. As many of you may know, Bill Viola's work deals with some of the central themes of human consciousness and experience. Bill's wife and collaborator, Kira Paraf, explains it like this. He first used the video camera and lens as a surrogate eye to bring things closer or to magnify them, to experiment with perception, to extend vision, and make lengthy observations of simple objects. Once you do that, their essence becomes visible. So he has always been interested in the inner life of the world around him. His goal, and our goal in showing the work, is to immerse viewers in an inner world, one that is created for them, but one also that leaves plenty of room for discovery and reflection. Bill has said, art for me is like the process of waking up the soul. So the big question is how to preserve Bill's life's work, that of waking up the soul. Quite simply, by keeping the work alive, by exhibiting, publishing, documenting, and conserving. I've had the privilege of working closely with Bill and Kira for 15 years, and over many of those years, we talked about getting started on a catalogue raisonné, but we knew it would be a massive undertaking. Once we did get going, it seemed that we had a pretty good steer on things, thanks to the comprehensive archives kept by the studio. However, provenance was one aspect that we hadn't yet fully addressed until this conference made us aware of the work that we still need to do. The obvious issue with video and provenance is the medium itself, that is, its reproducibility. So how do you bestow ownership on a video work of art, its transfer to a new owner, and its provenance? One word, documentation. From the outset, Kira has felt a responsibility to Bill's public and private collectors to maintain every facet of the work, especially the intentions of the artist, by painstakingly preserving the archive and carefully documenting each work and its additions with collections information. As a result, the Viola Studio has issued a certificate with nearly every edition sold. And more uniquely for video art, the studio provides a comprehensive archive box for each work that is sent to collectors, private and public. The archive box shown here in this video contains the master tape clone and DVD copy of digital files, which is basically a backup of what is on the hard drive player that runs the work. There's a CD of high-res images consisting of video stills and installation shots. The letter of agreement addressed to the first owner of the work binds the collector or the institution to adhere to the plans and instructions of the artist in installing the work. There's a CD with images, guidelines for reproduction of images, captions for press, catalogues, wall labels. Crucially, there's the certificate of authenticity, signed, dated, and stamped by the artist, which includes the title of the work and its edition number. There's an equipment crate packing list, information about the handling and care of the tape masters, numerous installation documents, including floor plans for installation, guidelines and instructions for museum exhibition, instruction manuals for the equipment, pages and pages of technical information. That's a lot of documentation for one work. And over the course of his 40-year career, Bill has created approximately 240 works, including single-channel videotapes often produced for television broadcast, room-size video and sound installations, pure sound installations, 83 flat panel screen works consisting of editions of up to 7, 5, 7, or 12. There have been other projects such as the video for the 4-hour Tristan and Isolde opera, a 9 Inch Nails collaboration, and even a computer game. So with the studio's meticulous record keeping and all of those archive boxes, you'd think the Provenance issue would be sorted, but not quite. The truth is private collectors are often unaware of how crucial the archive box is, sometimes mislaying or even losing it because they're focused on the object, the thing on the wall. What they don't realize is that the thing on the wall is just a technical medium to convey the image. In other words, the image is the work. And that master tape clone in the archive box that we just looked at, that preserves the image and allows the owner to transfer the work to a new playback system or even refabricate the work in the event of a total loss. So the archive box with this master tape and certificate is in itself effectively the work. In conclusion, given the depth of the studio's archive, I'm confident that a comprehensive digital catalog raisonné of Bill Viola's work will be an effective means of conserving the artist's intention, proving authenticity, and tracking provenance of a medium which by its very nature is highly reproducible.
Feel free to add in at this point if there's a question you think should have been asked and want to answer.
I've got a sort of PS, partly arising from things we discussed. I should say that I read about catalogue raisonnés that have 50-person teams. Well, there was just me and one assistant researcher, and she, in fact, was most directly, her direct responsibilities were really provenance and exhibition history, rather than me. I mean, of course, I was often working on it, but they were most directly her responsibility. That's one thing. And the other, it's really, it's kind of plug for your forum, really. Arising from this forum, in a sense, I am, when I said I did the catalogue raisonné in the introduction, I'm also, I didn't give myself the title, but I'm called Head of Publishing for the Estate of Francis Bacon. And we've already put out 4 books since the catalogue raisonné under my editorship. I've only contributed to one of them so far, but I'm working hard on another one now for Francis Bacon Studies number 4. Very exciting. And it actually addresses some further issues. I'm going to publish works he destroyed, of which I found very good color transparencies that can be beautifully scanned. I didn't do it for moral and ethical reasons in the catalogue raisonné, and in any case, he destroyed them. But as I get older, I realize I'm not God. It's not my right to keep this from other people. My main duty now is to let other people decide. And some people would say it's a disgrace showing work he destroyed, but they're terribly interesting. They're not his greatest works. He was right to destroy them. I'd happily, in my opinion, I'd happily say that. But just to go back to the, just very briefly, that the forum has made me look at provenance in such a different way. And in terms of provenance and reception, I want to commission someone to do in Bacon Studies number, whatever it's going to be, a thing focused on provenance and then reception. And it's because I realize as a separate study, it can be not separate, of course, from the whole artwork question, but as a discipline within it, it's a way of learning interesting things. And I want someone to do a deep study of it, really, and we'll publish it. So that's really arisen from our topic. I hope it's true, and I hope it's a nice positive thing to say about it.
Well, I feel very vindicated because one of my pet peeves is that catalogue raisonnés are heavily used by collectors and by galleries and auction houses, and I think, and by curators to find works for exhibitions. I don't know that art historians often are aware of the sort of rich resources to take them in the direction of the social history, the critical history, the economic history of an artist's work. And I think pointing them to the various component parts of catalogue raisonné and provenance's essential role, and the artist as an owner as well, which works to the artists, has the artist loaned to exhibitions, which works remained in the studio and for what reasons, is a really fascinating and fertile territory. So I'm glad to hear you're thinking in those directions. I'll just say a final word, which is to thank the participants, Stephanie and Martin, for offering your insights into your artist's work and these issues of provenance. And a thank you to ICRA and to Lund Humphreys for co-sponsoring this event.